Welcome to our talk on learning transfer. In this talk, we will be outlining what is transfer, how can students develop the ability to transfer their learning, what are some of the challenges faced by teachers, and the barriers students encounter in effecting transfer of learning, and we will conclude with how technology can be used to facilitate transfer of learning. Transfer can be simply defined as the ability to extend what has been learned in one context to a new context. Having provided a simple definition of transfer, we should talk about the idea that even though you can define it simply, it is still a very complex notion. The complexity arises because transfer of learning involves several factors and variables. We could be talking about the transfer of learning between concepts within one subject area. We could be talking about the transfer of learning between subjects, or we could in fact be talking about the transfer of learning between what is learned in school and the world at large. Transfer of learning requires cognitive flexibility, and that takes time to practice and develop. There are several types of transfer, which will be discussed in greater detail in the next few slides. Perkins tells us that we must consider not just if transfer happens, but under what conditions transfer occurs and what the mechanisms of transfer are. So when does transfer occur? An example of transfer would be learning how to graph data in a chemistry class, and then being able to recognize the independent and dependent variables in a biology lab and select an appropriate graphing method in that class. The student will have successfully determined the common features, committed those to memory, and used that information in a new context. There are many types of transfer: positive and negative transfer, or look at how transfer influences learning. Negative transfer would inhibit learning in a new context. For example, if a student was learning unit conversions by memorizing, this would inhibit their ability to learn new unit conversion methods. Whereas if they were learning unit conversion using dimensional analysis techniques, those techniques are applicable with any unit conversion in any subject area, and that would facilitate a positive transfer of learning and improve their performance in a future context. Near and far transfer. Near transfer is very closely related to reflex transfer. For example, once you know how to drive a car, those skills are easily transferred to the very near concept of driving a truck. Far transfer, on the other hand, it requires you transferring your learning into an entirely different context. This is a much more mindful form of transfer, and it requires some conscious effort. This could be a transfer between school subjects or even out of the school context into the world at large. Mindful transfer requires metacognition, requires thinking about why you know what you know. Mindful transfer requires initial guidance and practice for novice learners. How do we affect this mindful transfer? This leads us into the next few slides, which deal with how can we help students develop the ability to transfer.
So one of the biggest things that is suggested is to provide connections as much as possible. So can we connect the information to other disciplines, other ideas, everyday life? And also we need to consider the individual social and cultural aspects that are connected to the learner. So the design needs to be relevant and consequential to the learner themselves. So pretty straightforward ideas, but easy to implement. And the next point is just trying to find as many ways as possible to link what is being taught in class to an authentic application. So if a student's learning something like apprenticeship math and you're studying a financial unit, can you link that to real life? So for budgeting or for looking at credit card debt, that sort of thing. So with providing as many connections as possible, you're taking, if you look up at the top here, you could think of that as isolated learning. So you've got all these little bits and pieces. They're not connected. You can't really see the bigger picture. But if we draw in as many connections as possible, we're going to help enable our students to see that bigger picture. Through providing connections, we're going to see that motivation's increased as well as learning transfer. One really easy way to incorporate connections into the classroom is through the use of something like a mind map. So related to connections, we looked at some literature that talked about framing context expansively. So again, that's just the idea of removing the bounds of the classroom and trying to connect it as much as possible across time, place, to different people, and thinking of learners as actively contributing to that knowledge building process. Transfer was found to be increased if students felt that what they're learning was important and likely to be useful down the road. The same literature also suggested the importance of encouraging learners to draw on their previous knowledge. So one sort of caveat with that is to check for misconceptions in that knowledge and ensure that it does have some focus towards the learning activity. They also mentioned this idea of students being accountable. So they need to learn and understand their role is to generate their own solutions to new problems and adapt existing knowledge. So another thing you can try to use with students is this idea of an invention activity. So that's just really simple. It's time to try something out first before teacher-led instruction. So it could be something like trying to find a general formula for calculating an average. So the process is quite simple. There's some time to invent at the start, so they may or may not be successful. That's not really important. Then there would be the teacher-led instruction, and then some time to practice what they've figured out and apply the methods to different problems. So these invention activities have shown improved transfer. And you might ask, well, why is that? What's happening? Greater increase in agency. Students are learning from the failures. So by going through the process of invention, they're learning more about the components of the problem and how they interact. So they're getting a deeper understanding. And it's also been found to be quite a motivating type of activity. So another thing that's important to consider is this idea of providing as many examples of concepts in various contexts as possible. So a couple different ways that can be done is to have learners solve a specific case and then use additional similar cases to help abstract the principles. Or it's kind of the reverse idea. You can have the instructor generalize a case so learners can apply that to a whole class of related problems. Another way we can help students learn to transfer is through the use of analogy. So the benefits of analogy is that it helps students recognize the higher order relationships that exist between two domains. It helps them draw on prior knowledge, so something that they understood really well, and then link that to the new information. So it's helping them give meaning to that new information. There's a really great example of this. If you Google fortress and tumor problem, there's a problem that was given to a bunch of med students during a research study, and it's a really interesting example of how this works. There's not much time to talk about it here, but I definitely suggest checking it out. What they found, though, in that research is that people really needed kind of a hint or a bridge to make the connections. The last thing I'm going to talk about is the idea that, learning to transfer is kind of a process in itself. So what types of info, rules, strategies, metacognition, self-regulation, domain-specific problem-solving techniques are relevant across different learning situations? It's going to take a little bit of time for students to start recognizing that and learning to identify when information might actually be useful again. So overall, it's just going to take a little bit of practice to improve transfer.
School subjects are often taught in isolation from each other. This over-contextualization is a barrier to knowledge transfer. Students find it difficult to see the relationship between subjects when they are not given guidance, opportunities, and practice in finding the links. Time to learn. It takes time to learn a concept. Even the most talented individuals invest a lot of time to practice to develop skills. Covering too many topics too quickly may cause problems. Such problems include a lack of connections and organization of principles. Learning just can't be rushed. Foundations. Transfer is influenced by the degree of mastery of an original subject. Without it, transfer can't be expected. However, students may misinterpret new information based on previous information. Prior experience can be a barrier to knowledge transfer. Cultural or home life factors may also inhibit transfer between school and life. Oversimplifications can also hinder a student's ability to transfer. For example, students who are taught the Bohr model of the atom and are told the third shell can hold 8 electrons often have a very difficult time understanding electron configurations later in school life when we teach them that there can be 18 electrons in the third shell. This inhibits their ability to move forward with this new information. Oversimplifications like this, set from prior years, form a barrier and interfere with the student's ability to see things and transfer what they do know into a new context. Understanding versus memorizing. It is easier to transfer information and make connections to content students understand versus information that is simply being memorized. The learner needs to be engaged. Simply telling students the information they need to know limits their ability to internalize the knowledge, therefore limiting their ability to transfer the knowledge. It is also challenging as a teacher to ensure that students are constantly understanding the information that is being presented to them rather than simply memorizing it. Performance versus learning. Sometimes we focus too much on the end product of certain learning experiences, such as when we use a test or a quiz, rather than how the students are learning. Transfer is viewed as an active and dynamic process rather than a passive process. Simply telling students the material they need to know limits their ability to internalize the knowledge piece. Motivation to learn and relevance. The amount of motivation a student has affects the amount of time that student is willing to dedicate to learning. Motivating students to learn can be a difficult task, especially when the student does not find the content interesting. School subjects tend to remove the relevance of the material for many students. They present the information in an artificial manner, also isolating knowledge. This removes an opportunity for students to see how the knowledge is transferable. Authentic activities provide the student with experience in seeing the material connected to the wider world.
Using technology to increase transfer. As Zhang, Meyer, and Engel said, all the instructor needs to do is to connect the learning environment to other times, places, and participants in ways that his or her students will believe and be ready to act upon. So in other words, if we can find a way to use technology to effectively expand the classroom in its temporal and spatial dimensions, we can help facilitate our students' transfer of learning. Students can use media to explore the world around them that they cannot access in other ways. They can manipulate models or lab simulations and discover quickly how changing one variable will alter an outcome. For example, a spreadsheet created in a computer class can then be retrieved and modified for a set of chemistry lab calculations. Often in physics and chemistry, students are required to manipulate data by using common software. The teachers can facilitate the transfer of students, the students will use the same skills in each class. Technology can also improve communication. Teachers are often isolated by the geography of the school. The science wing is far away from the English department. And yet, if the teachers can instantly communicate through chat or email with each other, they can point out that they're doing similar types of projects. Perhaps they are both requiring a piece of writing. And this could be used to make connections between writing skills in both classes. And finally, technology can be used to provide authenticity, which provides relevance for students, and this increases the likelihood that transfer will occur.